It's been almost 2 years since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan after the US withdrew their troops from the country. They'd maintained a military presence since their invasion 20 years ago. Well, the regime has been criticised for stripping back women's rights. And although some British nationals remain in the country, the British embassy in Kabul remains closed. However, the chair of the Defence Select Committee, Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood, has just returned from meeting with the Taliban. He says things have changed. Let's take a look. I think we'll call this sort of his report from Afghanistan.
Well, I'm here back in Helmand province in Afghanistan, courtesy of the Halo Trust. And all that's happened here since 9/11, this is a very different country indeed. It feels different now that the Taliban have returned to power.
Well, it may be hard to believe, but security has vastly improved, corruption is down, and the opium trade has all but disappeared. You quickly appreciate this war-weary nation is, for the moment, accepting a more authoritarian leadership in exchange for stability.
Well, here in Kabul, the streets are relatively safe. The checkpoints have all gone, businesses are reopening, the economy is starting to function. Well, I depart Afghanistan with a better appreciation as to how we can help this vulnerable country that feels abandoned by the international community. It is time to reopen the embassies. It is time to re-engage, and Britain should lead the way.
Well, Tobias joins us now. Thank you very much for your time. I know you've said that you're kind of keen to clear some things up. So I think that let's start with saying, do you regret the way you've tried to make your case?
Yeah, I think it's important politicians, put their hand up when perhaps they could express things far better. In 2 minutes and 20 seconds, that all you have is to put across. Absolutely, if I may, just for a second, put my visit into context. I've visited the country a number of times. I lost my brother back in 2002 in the Bali bombing. That drew me to visit the country many times over the last decade to understand what was going on, what we were doing to improve the country. Sadly, I saw the demise of our efforts there. During my visit last week, I saw an eerie calm, a visible change in security and corruption and opium growth, which I felt obliged to report. But I also saw a very vulnerable economy that without international intervention will collapse, turning the country back into a failed state with those terrorist camps returning. And I saw increased restrictions on women and girls, which you didn't mention in that clip. This suggests our current strategy of shouting from afar, after abruptly abandoning the country, after all the sacrifices that we made, is simply not working. And my call to action, as I said in that video, was for us to reopen the embassy again, as the EU embassy is open now, and pursue a more direct strategy to influence, to help the 40 million people abandoned, particularly the women and girls, after such a huge loss of life and sacrifice that we put in.
Has your strategy meant you've slightly lost the confidence of some of your colleagues because they've had some pretty stinging criticism, even calls for you to resign in the approach you've taken, which some people are saying, this looks like, at the worst, propaganda for the Taliban?
No, not at all. It's a realization that we've given up on a country. And what I'm seeing is a correlation between the increased restrictions that are being imposed by a Taliban and the absence of international aid. It's my view that a deal could be struck, might be possible, if we were to engage. I better appreciated the tensions within the Taliban. There's a lot of hardliners there that would splinter away and join ISIS-K, the terrorist group. I do believe that the country will collapse if the international community doesn't engage soon. And I also saw what is happening to the women and girls there as well. These are, I raised very difficult questions, tough questions to the Taliban at every opportunity to say, why are you doing this? And they realized the quagmire that they face. Any female in Afghanistan needs to be able to see a doctor, a female doctor.
I'm interested that you've said that you've raised the concerns of women and girls with the Taliban, because the latest reports we've had from the UN is things like the Afghanistan have institutionalized discrimination against women and girls. That's at the heart of their ideology. When you asked them then how they were going to protect women, what did they say that gave you reassurance that engaging with them would better protect them?
Well, like I said, there's clearly tensions, political statements being made to appease the hardliners. In fact, many women are having to go and get licenses to work, and that is the way they're getting around this. But you're absolutely right. These are not the conditions that any woman should be able to face. My question is, shouting from afar, cutting the DFID budget with what we did, is that going to change things? The schooling of 11-year-olds, over 11s, girls, not allowed to go to schools. They actually get sent to madrasas instead, which is I learned. But I also learned that half of all children under the age of 11, girls and boys, are not going to school because the schools don't exist.
What makes you think that engaging with them, they're a trustworthy group that would then say, OK, we've listened? Because they said initially when they took over power that women and girls would have far greater rights than they do have now. So why do you trust them 2 years later?
I don't trust them at all. What I'm doing is learning more about them and seeing what is the art of the possible. This is the diplomacy that we now need to work through. The reason why I say that they are advancing and progressing ever restrictions is in my view, is part of the deal that they're trying to get the international community to gain their attention. Now, what has been interesting in the last few days, there's been no discussion of Afghanistan. We've absolutely forgot it. We've cut our support for the UN programs. That's what this government has done. And I absolutely put my hand up and say I could have absolutely worded those my videos better. But I'm passionate about trying to understand how we can better help this country, driven by the fact that, I lost my brother to a terrorist attack. And I do believe that we have a better way of helping if we reopen the embassy and put the case forward to say, we can provide international aid, but we can...
You've made those points. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's part of your video, you said you didn't want to be shouting out from afar. You wanted to engage. Has your strategy actually meant that you are another person shouting out from far, not engaging? Because the government have said they've got no intention of changing their policy towards the Taliban. So maybe what your intentions are, maybe positive, you've sort of scuppered them in the way you've gone about it.
I haven't scuppered them. I make it very, very clear.
Sorry, the government said they've got no intention of changing the policy towards the Taliban. You potentially had the opportunity to persuade them with the knowledge and the intel that you've come back with, and you haven't managed to do that.
I'm just a backbencher. I didn't go there as chair of the Defence Select Committee, as you suggested in your introduction. I made it very, very clear. I went there, and it's some uncomfortable truths about what happened there. I make it clear that I visited that country, a dozen times over the last decade. And I was really dismayed by the absence of a strategy to deal with the umbrella of security that our brave service personnel provided. And we didn't do enough to understand the tribal networks of what was going on in this country. We didn't understand how we could leave a legacy there, an indigenous capability. That was completely absent. We then abandoned the country completely. And what I've noticed, and in my visit, I was then able to realize and appreciate that the massive scale of corruption that was embedded in the last government, has disappeared. Security is very different. I was able to travel right across Helmand, right across Kandahar, right across Kabul. Very, very different. So do we then utilize this situation that we've gifted? We handed this country back to the very insurgents that we went in to defeat. That's what we've done. And I'm simply suggesting, how do we best help the 40 million people that we've abandoned? How do we help the women and the girls get back to school? Our current strategy is not working. It is failing. And what the Taliban is requiring and requesting, knowing that their country will fail otherwise, is the international community to engage. So there's a quid pro quo there that can only be discovered, in my view, if the West and the British open their embassies and quietly have those discussions that I had myself. It shouldn't be me doing this. It should be our embassy. It should be our Foreign Office.
Understood. Tobias Ellwood, thank you very much for your time, MP and on the Defence Select Committee. Well, lots to discuss. Joining me in the studio is Leon and also the TalkTV presenter Nicola Thorpe. Leon, let's just start with you. Let's take the bizarre execution of the messaging and just look at the issue at its heart. Is this now the moment to say we've got to re-engage with the Taliban in a different way to try and engineer change for the rights, particularly of women and children in the country?
Yeah, well, I've got to ask the question, what planet is Tobias Ellwood living on? Because, you know, I think in one breath he's saying we need to reopen diplomatic routes of Afghanistan. In the next breath, he's saying he doesn't trust them one bit. You can't have diplomacy without trust. And I just think that what he's done, as you pointed out expertly, Rosie, is that the government have effectively pushed back on this, and I think it is admirable that over the long term we should be having a relationship with Afghanistan, because the UK and the US and other NATO allies have a responsibility, I believe, to that country, but not now. The Taliban have done nothing to prove that now is the moment to reopen those diplomatic links. We've seen women and girls being treated like second-class citizens. You know, we've seen that they can't visit beauty salons, they can't have access to an education. You know, God forbid that you are gay or part of a minority that could be persecuted in Afghanistan. The Taliban is not an organisation that the UK government should be anywhere near, and I think it's frankly offensive what Tobias Ellwood has gone and done.
Completely echo every sentiment there. I think when I watched that video, and it was the music for me that felt like the strongest element of propaganda there. It felt like it absolutely was. It was like an advert for the new and reformed Afghanistan. I think it was highly offensive to any woman who was watching that. And of course, he's saying he can go through Afghanistan right now as a male, as, you know, on a diplomatic mission, as it were. It's interesting that he's now stepping back, he says, wants to distance himself from his role from the Defence Select Committee. No, this is not the way to go about it. You were absolutely spot on when you said any chances of, I think, this government potentially reopening the embassy now, because of this, what is ultimately a PR disaster, will make it very, very difficult.
Eventually, and you've sort of hinted at this, if we want to help the lives and the livelihoods of those women, some kind of action's got to be taken. You were saying it's not now. What, Nicola, do you think needs to be put in place to say, OK, we can engage with you?
I guess it has to be done, well, now from afar, or at least not be done in such a Twitter-ready way. It felt like a personal PR mission here for Tobias Ellwood. He should be engaging with Halo Trust. Absolutely engage with the Taliban in the way that you see fit, but then don't go onto Twitter and boast about it.
But then, I guess, if his strategy was misfired, and I think by admitting and saying I wanted to clear things up, he's realised that this has really not gone down well, which I'm sure wasn't his intention when he did this. If we go back to what you were saying before, what do you put in place to say, OK, we can start to have conversations, or do you say that's not appropriate at all right now? I
think right now it isn't appropriate at all. We've seen very recently the way in which Taliban is governing Afghanistan, and it isn't compatible with the type of country the UK should be having diplomatic links with. And I think we should put in place a roadmap that quite clearly gives the Taliban targets to be able to meet when it comes to women and girls, when it comes to safeguarding of people's liberties. And if they can meet those targets over a period of time, if they can prove that trust that Tobias said is missing, then is the time to re-engage. But I've seen nothing, and, you know, I'm not on the ground, Tobias is, so let's give him cut him a bit of slack for that. But I do think that we have to have that level of trust before we re-engage. And I'd say one final point on that. The Americans, you know, the Taliban was the people who harboured the terrorists behind the 9/11 attack. America is one of our biggest, most important allies. I think it's wrong for a British MP to be effectively freelancing with foreign policy on the back of a trip to Afghanistan, as important as it may have been. You know, I think there's a much wider context here, and he hasn't got the remit to be delivering that.
What about his argument that it's time to reopen the British embassy, Nicola?
Well, I suppose he's got an argument there. If the EU have reopened their embassy, we certainly want to be seen at the forefront of that. But I'm totally with you. If he's saying he himself, the biggest sort of spokesperson for this, I even cannot trust the people that I've been with for the past however many days, then I don't really see how opening an embassy could, first and foremost, be safe, and then secondly, be effective.
The question will be now how much politically this causes a problem in terms of any positive action that the Halo Trust wanted to take or other members of government. What do you see as sort of next steps? If you've got a bit of empathy with the points you were making, but you think, well, you've misfired spectacularly in how you tried to deliver it, what are the next steps?
Well, I don't know, and this is the problem. He's blown himself up to an extent, because this is not going to help the cause, and I think he has to now go back and you know, give a fuller apology and say, actually, I got it wrong. Here's how I want to work constructively with a variety of different stakeholders, including the UK government.
I think he did admit he had got it wrong.
He did admit, but the damage has been done, right? I mean, you know, we're talking about it here, and I think we can see now that there is no hope in hell of the embassy being reopened, of diplomatic ties being re-established, because we've seen the backlash that's been caused by it. If what he was doing...
You think the PR disaster is so significant that that means the embassy wouldn't be able to open?
Well, I think that ultimately
we're talking about it.
Rishi Sunak is not going to be able to turn around and say, "That's a good idea, Tobias. I'm going to do it tomorrow." It's not going to happen. This is set back the cause of actually re-establishing those diplomatic links. And I think if what he was doing was sending up a weather balloon to test the public's temperature, to test the temperature within Parliament as to what people might think about it, then he can count that as a success.
Yeah.
But in terms of actually getting to that end goal, no chance.
Okay.